Welcome to Stories with Grandma Joan. I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to read Chapter 3 of Mrs. Pigglewiggle's Farm. It's called The Destructiveness Cure. And here's a picture of Mrs. Pigglewiggle's farm, by the way. Okay, here we go. Who's been monkeying with the lawnmower? Shouted Mr. Phillips from the garage. Did you call Hearthrug, dear? Said Mrs. Phillips from the vegetable garden where she was weeding her radishes. Yes, I called him, said Mr. Phillips. Who has been fooling with the lawnmower? One wheel is missing, the bolts are gone, and the handle and there are ball bearings all over the garage floor. Oh dear, said Mrs. Phillips, getting up off her knees and sighing deeply. I suppose it was Jeffy. He was playing in there yesterday. Tell him to come here, said Mr. Phillips. I can't, said Mrs. Phillips. He's gone to spend the day with Billy Robinson. Call the Robinsons, growled Mr. Phillips. Call up the Robinsons and tell them to send our destroying angel home. I can't, said Mrs. Phillips, coming into the garage. She bent over and started to gather the ball bearings up in her gardening basket. Leave those alone, please, Sybil, said Mr. Phillips. Just leave them there for Jeff. I've had just about enough of his destroying things. From now on, and starting with this lawnmower, he is putting things back together. But Hearthrug, dear, do you think he can? Asked Mrs. Phillips, looking at the garage floor, which was littered with about 40 tiny lawnmower parts. I don't care whether he can do it or not. He's going to do it, said Mr. Phillips, his eyes blazing. Please go call the Robinsons, dear. It won't do any good, said Mrs. Phillips, because Horace Root Robinson has driven the children to Green River Falls for the day. They've taken a picnic and won't be home until 8 o'clock tonight. Well, said Mr. Phillips, that's a fine state of affairs. Gone on a picnic. A reward, I suppose, for tearing the lawnmower to pieces. That's the trouble with children today. When they misbehave, they're not punished. They're rewarded. Now, Hearthrug, said Mrs. Phillips, please be reasonable. I didn't send Jeff to the Robinsons as a reward for taking the lawnmower apart. I didn't know he had taken it apart. I sent him to the Robinsons because Horace Root called and invited him. Today is Billy's 10th birthday, and the picnic is his party. Now, as long as you can't cut the lawn, why don't you just go and lie down in the lawn swing? I'll make you a pitcher of lemonade. All right, said Mr. Phillips. I was really too tired to cut the lawn anyway. Say, as long as you're in the kitchen, how about making me a root beer ice cream soda? Of course, said Mrs. Phillips. And would you like a bologna sandwich to go with it? Yes, said Mr. Phillips, walking over and sinking weakly down into the lawn swing. But be sure and put plenty of mustard on the bread. Use that Russian rye bread I brought home yesterday. And don't forget the dill pickles, please. All right, said Mrs. Phillips. And Sybil, said Mr. Phillips as Mrs. Phillips went into the room, better make it 2 sandwiches. And don't forget the lettuce and the mayonnaise. Okay, said Mrs. Phillips. After Mrs. Phillips had made the sandwiches, using plenty of mustard and not forgetting the lettuce and mayonnaise or the pickles, she got out the ice cream and the root beer for the root beer ice cream soda. Then she opened the cupboard where she kept her electric blender. Uh-oh, the cupboard was empty. The blender was not there. Could I have loaned the blender to someone? Mrs. Phillips wondered, opening the cupboard after cupboard. Going out on the back porch, she called Mr. Phillips in the lawn swing. Hearthrug, darling, do you remember my loaning my electric blender to anyone? If you did, it was either this morning or after 12 o'clock last night, said Mr. Phillips, because I made myself a chocolate malt at 11:30 last night. Oh, of course, I remember, said Mrs. Phillips. And you didn't wash it, and you left the drain board half an inch deep with chocolate syrup, malted milk, and melted ice cream. Mr. Phillips closed his eyes wearily. Going back in the house, Mrs. Phillips began her search for the blender. Finally, after half an hour, when she realized it just wasn't to be found, she ran across the street to borrow Mrs. Harpoon's blender. Mrs. Harpoon said, Certainly you can borrow my blender, Sybil, but I thought Jeffy said he had yours fixed. He was working on it early this morning, I remember." "Where was he working on it?" asked Mrs. Phillips. "Oh, out in the garage," said Mrs. Harpoon. "My goodness, he and Donnie were out there at a little after 6 this morning." With a sinking heart, Mrs. Phillips walked out to the Harpoons' garage. There on the workbench, in about 50 pieces, was her nice new blender. She said, "Do you have a paper bag I can borrow, Heather?" "Certainly," said Mrs. Harpoon. "My, but that little Jeffy of yours is a wonderful mechanic. Really, I think he's a genius. He is so thorough." "He's thorough, anyway," said Mrs. Phillips, gathering up all the tiny little parts of the blender and putting them in a paper bag. "Well, thanks, Heather," she said. "I'll bring your blender home the minute I'm finished with it. And please, whatever you do, never, ever let Jeffy touch it." Mr. Phillips was pretty cross at having to wait so long for his lunch, so Mrs. Phillips didn't say anything to him about the blender. Instead, she put the paper bag in the cupboard and wrote a note on her shopping list. "Take blender to see if it can be fixed." After he had had his lunch and a restful nap, Mr. Phillips felt much better and decided to try and put the lawnmower back together himself. Humming, he went down to the basement to get his tools. A minute later he came roaring back into the kitchen. His face was purple. In his hands the pieces of his brace and bit, and pieces of his level. "Look, just look, my best tools, and they are ruined," he said to his wife. Mrs. Phillips said, "Don't complain to me, Hearthrug. I just went to get out the vacuum cleaner, and it is in 10,000 pieces. The carpet sweeper is in 60 pieces, and here," she jerked open the cupboard where she had put the parts of the blender, "here is my brand new electric blender," and she began to cry. Putting his broken tools on the drain board of the sink, Mr. Phillips peered into the paper bag of blender parts and then said, "Sybil, I'm going to buy a razor strap, the biggest, strongest one made, and I'm going to wrap it up and give it to that boy for a present and see if he can make something out of it." Mrs. Phillips cried even more. She said, "Oh, don't be so angry. He's just a boy." "All right, then," said Mr. Phillips. "What would you suggest?" "I don't know," sobbed Mrs. Phillips. "I don't know. But there must be something that can be done." "I don't know. I'm going to ask Greta Rockstall what to do. She has 8 children, you know." "Do whatever you please," said Mr. Phillips. "But don't come crying to me when you find your sewing machine, or your electric iron, or your waffle iron, or your toaster, or your—" "Oh, Hearthrug, please," said Mrs. Phillips, dialing the telephone number of her friend, Greta Rockstall. When she told Greta all the terrible things Jeffy had done, Greta laughed and said, "We had the very same trouble with my Wiki. He took our phonograph and our electric mixer apart, and then got the parts mixed up, and then when they were put back together, the mixer played music and the phonograph ground up the records. And another time he put the power lawnmower motor on the baby carriage and started it. That was when Electra was only 4 months old, and she went clear to Centerville, and we didn't know a thing about it until a garage man called and said the baby carriage was out of gas. And what did we want to do about it? He got our name from Electra's identification tag." "Oh, my goodness, that's the most terrible thing I've ever heard," said Mrs. Phillips. "What did you do? I mean, how did you punish him?" "I sent him to Mrs. Piggle," said Mrs. Rockstall. "She is so wonderful with children and always seems to know just how to cure their faults." "Of course," said Mrs. Phillips with such a big sigh of relief it blew the leaves of the telephone book all over the table. "I can't imagine why I didn't think of Mrs. Piggle. Goodness knows Jeffy used to spend time at her house. Is she still living in the same place?" "No, she isn't," said Mrs. Rockwell. "She has a farm now. It is in Little Spring Valley, just at the edge of town. Her number's in the phone book, though. Why don't you call her right now, Sybil? It'll be such a relief to your mind." "I will," said Mrs. Phillips. "Thank you so much for your help, Greta. I'll let you know what Mrs. Piggle says." Tuesday morning, as soon as she finished milking, Mrs. Piggle hurried up to the house and began making buckwheat cakes and cooking little pork sausages. The sausages were just beginning to brown when Mrs. Phillips's station wagon turned into the lane. Mrs. Piggle, Wag, and Lightfoot went out to the back porch to wait for Jeffy. The car had barely stopped when he jumped out, ran up the back steps, and gave Mrs. Piggle a big hug. "I'm certainly glad you came early," Mrs. Piggle said. "I'm baking buckwheat cakes, and I've got fresh honey." "Oh, boy," Jeffy said. "Well, bye, Mom." "Goodbye nothing," said Mrs. Piggle. "I've invited your mother to have breakfast, too." "But I mustn't stay," said Mrs. Phillips. "I have a meeting at the driftwood polishers, bleachers, and arrangers at noon, and I promised Stella Packinghouse I would bring a casserole dish. I think I'll make my favorite prune, noodle, and sardine surprise." "Ugh!" said Jeffy. "How many sausages can I have, Mrs. Piggle?" "It is May I," said Mrs. Phillips, "and don't be such a piggy." "Would 11 be enough?" asked Mrs. Piggle. "If it isn't, I'll cook more." "Zowie!" said Jeffy. "Well, goodbye," said Mrs. Phillips. "Please be good and do as Mrs. Piggle tells you, and try not to eat her out of house and home." "What do you mean by that?" asked Jeffy, stuffing 3 sausages in his mouth. "I mean," said his mother, "that you should eat your sausages one at a time, and should cut them in pieces instead of stuffing them into your mouth whole." "Okay," said Jeffy, waving at her. But after his mother had driven away, he ate 14 buckwheat cakes, 14 sausages, and while he ate he told Mrs. Piggle all the news about all the children in town. He knew all about the Brownie Scouts who had flown up and were now Girl Scouts, and all the Cub Scouts who had climbed up and were now Boy Scouts. He knew who was mad at whom and why, and who was the best friends with whom and why. He even knew the exact day that Patsy's grandmother was coming from New Orleans, and that Susan Gray was going to have the braces taken off her teeth on the 7th of August. Mrs. Piggle enjoyed her breakfast so much she almost forgot to put Artibus out in the pasture. "Heavens to Betsy," she said, jumping up. "Here it is 7:30, and I haven't finished my chores." "What chores?" said Jeffy. "Can I help? I'll drive that old cow." So he and Mrs. Piggle went down to the barn, and while Mrs. Piggle cleaned up the milk room, he turned Artibus out into the south pasture, petted Clematis and the lambs, fed Fanny, and watched the piggies. He enjoyed himself so very much. Then Mrs. Piggle had to go up to the house and order some more calf meal, and so she told Jeffy to amuse himself until she came back. He amused himself by undoing all the straps on Trotsky's bridle, taking the stirrups off the saddle, taking the pins out of the wheel on Mrs. Piggle's old farm cart, and with the blade of his pocket knife loosening the screws that fastened the hinges on the door to Fanny's pen. When Mrs. Piggle came out back, she handed Jeffy a small toolbox. She said, "This is my toolbox. I understand you're very good at fixing things, so while you are visiting me, I'll just put you in charge of the tools, and when anything gets broken, you can fix it." "Oh, boy," said Jeffy, "I like to fix things." "That's splendid," said Mrs. Piggle. "While I gather the eggs and feed the chickens, you take a look around and see if anything needs fixing." So Jeffy took the toolbox and went importantly up to the watering trough, and in no time at all he had broken off the faucet handle so that it was impossible to turn the water either off or on. Then he went on to the back porch, took the pump apart, undid the doorbell so that it wouldn't ring, dismantled a small churn, loosened the screw eyes that held up the porch swing, and finally took apart the toolbox itself, which was metal and put together with very nice hinges. He was sitting in the sunshine taking apart his Mickey Mouse wristwatch when Mrs. Piggle came up from the barn. She said, "Did you find anything that needed fixing, Jeffy?" "Yes, the faucet of the watering trough worked kind of hard. I tried to fix it, but I kind of broke off the handle." "Oh, that's too bad," she said, "because we can't get a new handle until we go to town on Thursday. However, until we get a new handle, you can pump water here on the porch and carry it down to the trough. The buckets are there on the bench. Well, you see, that is, said Jeffy. I figured the pump wasn't working just right, and so I took it apart, and I'm not sure I can put it back together again. Oh, mercy, said Mrs. Piggle, walking over and looking at the pump, which was strewn all over the bench. Well, in that case, I guess you'll just have to carry water from the spring. You know, a spring is like a little creek or a river. It's up behind the house. You go out past the woodshed and follow that little trail until you get to it. Here, you'd better take 2 buckets. She handed Jeffy 2 12-quart milk buckets. Whistling rather tunelessly, he jumped off the porch and ran across the backyard. Hey, this is fun, he said to himself. I bet that old spring's got bullfrogs in it and maybe a big swimming hole. He started up the path. It was very narrow and overgrown with blackberries and nettles. Ooh, ouch! Jeffy yelled at a blackberry vine as a blackberry vine grabbed him around the arm and made a long red scratch on his skin. He hit at the vine with the bucket and a nettle bent down and stung him on the back of the neck. Oh, this is awful, he said as a mosquito bit him on the nose. Why doesn't somebody cut this old path back? Because we seldom have to use it, said Mrs. Piggle from behind him. Here, let me by, and I'll sickle you a path. I had better make it nice and broad because you will be using it a great deal. Animals drink an enormous amount of water, you know. The spring was pretty. It bubbled coolly, and Jeffy did see a big bullfrog, but the path down to the spring. Here he is carrying the buckets with all the weeds and nettles and scratchy, itchy things. But the path down to the spring was slippery and there were lots of mosquitoes, and with a bucket of water in each hand he couldn't slap at those mosquitoes. Once he tried, but the water slopped over and filled his shoe. He found that water is the heaviest, sloppiest, hardest thing in the world to carry, and what was worse, Trotsky alone could drink a bucket with one slurp. All the long, hot afternoon Jeffy staggered back and forth from the spring. He was hot and itchy and stung all over with nettles. Then he had an idea. Oh, he did have such an idea. He would hitch Trotsky to the cart and drive back and forth from the spring. Gosh, said with Trotsky he could carry about 4 10-gallon milk cans of water at one time. This would be easy, he thought. The first blow, of course, was the harness which he had taken apart so thoroughly that morning. For an hour he buckled and unbuckled, but he couldn't seem to get it just right. So then he thought, I'll just take the cart myself. I won't be able to carry milk cans of water, but I can carry about 4 buckets at a time. So he lugged the cart across the barnyard, past the house and up to the spring. It was very, very hard work, and when he had finally got it up to the spring, he was so hot he had to lie down and slap cold water on his face. After he had cooled off, he filled the 4 buckets, loaded them in the cart, and started home. Pulling the cart with the 4 buckets of water in it was quite a job, even for a husky 9-year-old boy. It's this darned path, Jeffy kept saying to himself as he pushed and pulled and jounced along. As soon as I get to Mrs. Pigglewiggle's yard, it will be easy as pie, though. When he finally got to Mrs. Pigglewiggle's yard, the left wheel came off the cart. The cart tipped over, and all the water spilled. Oh no! Jeffy was so mad he kicked the wagon wheel as hard as he could, which was a mistake because he had on tennis shoes. Ouch! He shrieked. Ah, my toe is broken. Help! Help! I'm in agony, he said. What in the world is the matter? Asked Mrs. Pigglewiggle from the porch where she was shelling peanuts for peanut brittle. My toe! Jeffy yelled. I've broken it. Well, come here on the porch and let me take a look at it, said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. The toe was very red and swollen, but Mrs. Pigglewiggle wiggled it and said she didn't think it was broken. I like that sentence. Mrs. Pigglewiggle wiggled it. She made Jeffy lie in the hammock and gave him 6 large, fresh ginger cookies and a glass of lemonade for medicine. He said he felt much better right away. As soon as she finished with the peanuts, Mrs. Pigglewiggle called up Mr. Larson and asked him if he had a spare faucet or perhaps could fix her pump. He said he would be right over. Mrs. Piggle met him at the barn and talked to him for quite a while in a low voice. Then he came up, lifted Jeffy out of the hammock and carried him down to the watering trough, set him down on his good foot and said, "Now, son, I'll tell you what to do, but you're going to fix the faucet. After all, you were strong enough to take it apart, so you should be smart enough to put it back together. Now, first you take this Stilson wrench and—" So when Jeffy had fixed the faucet and filled the watering trough, Mr. Larson carried him up to the porch and sat him on the bench by the pump. "Now, son," he said, "you're going to learn how to fix a pump." By the time he had taught Jeffy how to fix the pump, Mr. Larson had to go home and milk his cows. He said, "It's all right, though. I don't think you'll need me for anything else, Mrs. Piggle. This young feller is pretty darn handy with tools." "Thanks, Mr. Larson," Jeffy said, scratching a big mosquito bite on his leg. "Thanks ever so much for showing me how to fix the faucet and the pump." "That's all right, Jeffy," said Mr. Larson. "Some day you can come over and help me with my tractor." "As soon as my toe gets well," Jeffy said, "I'll ride Trotsky over if it's okay." Then he remembered the bridle and his face turned brick red. He said, "Say, Mrs. Piggle, are there any kind of instructions about putting bridles together? I mean, buckling the right pieces to the right pieces?" Mrs. Piggle laughed. She said, "I guess there are, Jeffy, but I don't happen to have any. However, after supper I'll bring the bridle up here and show you how to put it back together." While Mrs. Piggle was milking, Jeffy limped over to the steps, sat down, and put the toolbox back together. Then he put all the tools neatly away. He felt better somehow. Then he remembered the churn, and he fixed that. He was working on the doorbell when Mrs. Piggle called him to supper. After supper she showed him how to fix the bridle, and then she made him soak his toe and go to bed. He was very, very tired, and his bed with its cool white sheets and blue and white patchwork quilt looked so inviting he forgot about his toe and made a great big leap from the rug right into the middle. There was a terrible crash, and he was lying squashed down between the springs and the mattress. "What happened? Are you hurt?" asked Mrs. Piggle as she helped him out. "I'm all right," Jeffy said sheepishly. "It's just that I guess I sort of forgot that I sort of loosened the screws in the bed this morning. I was testing out the screwdriver on my pocket knife." There he is when he fell. "I was testing out the screwdriver on my pocket knife to see if it was any good." "Well, was it?" asked Mrs. Piggle. "I guess so," said Jeffy. "All right," said Mrs. Piggle, laughing. "Sore toe or not, you'll have to help me lift this mattress and springs and put the bed back together now." "Where are the tools?" "Right here," said Jeffy, limping over and getting the toolbox off the window seat. So they put the bed back together, and Mrs. Piggle made it all fresh, and finally tucked Jeffy in. All night long he dreamed of boiling hot deserts without water, and of blackberry vines with thorns as big as daggers. He spent most of the next day lying in the hammock and soaking his toe. But the day after that he was much better, and before breakfast had fixed the wheels of the cart and tightened up all the bolts on the mowing machine. After breakfast, while Mrs. Piggle did her chores, he mended a broken place in the fence, nailed down a loose step, fixed a wiggly leg on a kitchen chair, and repaired the latch on the screen door. Mrs. Piggle told him she was very proud of him. After lunch, Mrs. Piggle walked over to Mrs. Larson's to get a bread and butter pickle recipe. She asked Jeffy to go along, but he said that his toe still hurt a little and he didn't really feel like walking. She told him to lie in the hammock and look at books, and that she would be home soon. For a little while after she had gone, Jeffy lay in the hammock and looked at the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Then he and Wag took a little walk down to the end of the lane. Then he played ball with Wag for a while. He'd throw the ball down the lane, and Wag would run and bring it back. Then he threw stones at crows, and the crows ducked and said, "Caw, caw, caw." Then he caught a few bees in a fruit jar. Then he wandered down to the barn. He could hear Fanny snoring clear out in the barnyard. He limped over to the pen and looked at her. Gee, you're disgusting, Fanny, he said. You're fat and dirty and you snore. Fanny opened one eye and looked at him. "Humph," she said, and began to snore again. Do you remember what kind of animal Fanny was? You make me sick, said Jeffy, just lying there and snoring. Why don't you wake up? Grrrrumph, Fanny said. The 13 little pigs all crowded down at the end of the pen where Jeffy was, hoping he would have something delicious for them to eat. Want to get away from your big fat mother while I'm here? He asked. Yes, yes, they squealed. So he opened the door into Lester's pen, and they hurried through and began sniffling around in the straw, hoping for a little extra grain of wheat or hidden crusts. Jeffy watched them for a while until he grew tired. Then he went back to lean over Fanny's pen and watch her. She was snoring again. For some reason this irritated Jeffy. That old pig's snoring makes me sick at my stomach, he told Wag. Why doesn't she get up and move around? Wag was busy sniffing at the piggies between the boards of Lester's pen and did not answer him. Well, I've got an idea, Jeffy said, limping out to the willow tree and breaking off a branch. He took the branch back to Fanny's pen and began tickling her with it. It was just right for tickling, long and supple, with a small bunch of leaves at the very end. At first, Fanny, who was used to flies and bugs, didn't apparently feel the tickling. She snored on, her fat legs and small hooves stretched straight out in front of her. Then Jeffy tickled her on the end of her snout. She snorted a little. He kept tickling. She opened one eye. He kept tickling. She got up with a roar and lunged at him. The whole pen quivered, but Jeffy laughed and flipped the willow switch at her. She lunged again, but this time she hit the door to the pen, the very door whose hinges Jeffy had loosened the first day he came. The hinges came off, the door crashed open, and Fanny was free. There she is, coming out of the pen. Jeffy almost fainted. Run, Wag, run! Fanny's out! He shouted, streaking for the barn door. Pigs are funny animals. They're big and fat and awkward and piggish, but they can run like lightning, especially mean old mother pigs. So when Jeffy reached the willow tree, Fanny's snout and her sharp teeth were only about 2 inches from his leg. Giving a jump that took him at least 4 feet off the ground, Jeffy snagged a branch, swung both legs up over his head, and grabbed a higher branch with his knees. He wasn't very comfortable, but he was safe. Below him, Fanny scratched her sides against the willow trunk and snarled. Wag, safe on the back porch, barked and barked. Jeffy's hands began to ache a little. He tried hanging on by one hand, and that made his arms ache. He wanted to get up by his knees so he wouldn't be hanging upside down. He tried giving a little swing with his body, and the branch under his knees creaked alarmingly. My, he was uncomfortable. His face was as red as a fire engine, and his toe ached. Where is Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle? He said. Then he began to shout, Help! Help! Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, help! Save me! He said. From above him in the tree, Penelope said, Oh, for heaven's sake, boy, quiet down. You're disturbing everyone. But I'm upside down, wailed Jeffy. Help! Help! He shouted again. What in the world's the matter with you? If you don't like being upside down, why don't you get out of the tree? Penelope said. Because Fanny's down there and she's going to bite me, said Jeffy, beginning to cry. Well, how did she get out? Penelope asked. She ought to be in her pen. She was, said Jeffy, but I loosened the hinges on her door the first day I came, and then I forgot all about it, and I was tickling her on the nose, and she charged, and the door came off, and she almost bit me. Well, you're a mischievous boy, and I don't have much sympathy for you, said Penelope, but I don't like Fanny either, so I'll help you. Now when I chase Fanny into the barn, you get down out of the tree and shut the door. I'll get out the hayloft window. How can you chase Fanny? Jeffy asked. Just watch and see, said Penelope. There was a great clatter of wings and then a thump, as she flew out of the willow tree and landed on the ground. Then, in an exact imitation of Mrs. Pigglewiggle's voice, she said, "Now, Fanny, get along. Go on. Get back in the pen. Hurry up now, Fanny. Supper, Fanny. I've got your nice supper. Hurry, Fanny." Fanny waddled into the barn. Like a flash, Jeffy was out of the tree and rolling the big barn door shut. As he latched the door, he could hear Penelope. "Nice girl, Fanny. Supper's ready." Then, from the loft window, Penelope said, "Now, you foolish boy, you'd better go up to the house and get your toolbox and the bucket of slops. I'll keep Fanny quiet until you get her food in the trough. Then, while she's eating, you put the hinges back on the door. All right now, scat, boy." Jeffy scattered. He was pretty nervous about going in the barn, but Penelope reminded him that if anything went wrong, and Fanny started after him, he could go up in the loft. "Anybody with an ounce of brains would have thought of that in the first place," she said. Jeffy thought so too, and was ashamed because he had been so dumb. So, carrying the bucket of slops in one hand and the toolbox under his arm, he squeezed through the barn door and tiptoed over to Fanny's pen. He could hear Penelope talking. "Quiet now, girls. Supper's coming. Quiet now." As soon as he dumped in the bucket of slops, Fanny lunged forward and buried her head in it. "Now," Penelope said, "quick, the door. Stand it up and fix those hinges." Jeffy's hands shook so the screwdriver kept jumping out of the slot in the screws, but finally he had one hinge on tight. With an anxious look at Fanny's trough, which was almost empty, he started on the other door. He had just finished when Fanny turned around and saw him. "Grumph," she said, and started toward him. Grabbing the toolbox, Jeffy ran to the ladder, then went up to the loft. "Don't worry, boy, the pen's holding," Penelope called out. She flew down from the rafter where she had been perched while directing things and waddled out to Jeffy. "Come on, boy," she said. "Well, you've got your tools out, and I wish you'd fix the door of my cage. It won't stay open and it won't stay shut." When Mrs. Pigglewiggle got home a little later, Jeffy had finished fixing Penelope's cage and was tightening up the porch swing. He told Mrs. Pigglewiggle all about Fanny and how Penelope had saved his life, and she said, "You're a good girl, Penelope. I'm proud of you. Here, have some sunflower seeds." "Delicious," said Penelope, eating one. "I'll fly down this afternoon, and thank you." "Oh, Jeffy," said Mrs. Pigglewiggle, "Nels is going to work on the tractor this evening. He said to tell you to bring your toolbox and come over after supper." "Oh, boy," said Jeffy, "I've always wanted to fix a tractor." And that was how Jeffy Phillips learned that tools are for fixing things, not just for taking them apart. Today, if you go down his street, you will see a big sign that says Jeffy Phillips and the Wickle Rockstall Repair Shop. We fix anything. They get lots of business too. Yesterday they got Patsy's big doll's eyes in, mended the broken chain on Dick Thompson's bicycle, and fixed Mrs. Harpoon's vacuum cleaner. They even helped Mr. Phillips clean the spark plugs on his car. When they weren't fixing things, they were building things. The first thing they built was a beautiful doghouse for Wag. They took it out to Mrs. Pigglewiggle's farm just last Sunday. She was simply delighted, and Wag was so happy he licked Jeffy's ears and untied Wickie's shoe. While they were playing around the farm, Jeffy noticed that the watering trough was getting kind of rotten in some places. They built a new, bigger one. Mrs. Pigglewiggle was very pleased, and Penelope said, "Glad I saved you from Fanny. You're a good boy." And that is the end of chapter 3. I'm so glad you came to listen. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.